With the Old Breed, Disc 7.
The relief, which had gone smoothly, was completed by 1100, and we were on our way to the northern defense zone of Peleliu. Our battalion deployed along the east road facing seaward, where we were to stop any counter-landing the Japanese might try. My mortar was emplaced near the road so we could fire on the strip of mangrove swamp between the narrow beach and the sea, as well as up the road toward the Umabrogel pocket if necessary. There was a sloping ridge to our rear, along which the rest of the company dug in defensively. We stayed there from the time we came off the line until the last week of the month. The area was quiet. We relaxed as much as we could with the nagging fear that we might get thrown into the line again if an emergency developed. We learned that our battalion would leave Peleliu as soon as a ship was available to transport us back to Pavuvu. By day we rested and swapped souvenirs, but we had to be on the alert at night for possible Japanese movement. To the south we could hear the constant rattle of machine guns and the thud of mortars and artillery, as the 81st Infantry Division kept up the pressure around the Umabrogel pocket. One day, a buddy told me he had a unique souvenir to show me. We sat on a rock as he carefully removed a package from his combat pack. He unwrapped layers of waxed paper that had originally covered rations and proudly held out his prize for me to see. "Have you gone Asiatic?" I gasped. "You know you can't keep that thing. Some officer'll put you on report sure as hell." I remonstrated as I stared in horror at the shriveled human hand he had unwrapped. "Aw, Sledgehammer, nobody'll say anything. I've got to dry it in the sun a little more so it won't stink," he said, as he carefully laid it out on the rock in the hot sun. He explained that he thought a dried Japanese hand would be a more interesting souvenir than gold teeth. So when he found a corpse that was drying in the sun and not rotting, he simply took out his K-bar and severed the hand from the corpse. And here it was. And what did I think? "I think you're nuts," I said. "You know the CO will raise hell if he sees that." "Hell no, Sledgehammer. Nobody says anything about the guys collecting gold teeth, do they?" he argued. "Maybe so," I said. "But it's just the idea of a human hand. Bury it." He looked grimly at me, which was totally out of character for his amiable good nature. "How many Marines you reckon that hand pulled the trigger on?" he asked in an icy voice. I stared at the blackened, shriveled hand and wondered about what he said. I thought how I valued my own hands and what a miracle to do good or evil the human hand is. Although I didn't collect gold teeth, I had gotten used to the idea, but somehow a hand seemed to be going too far. The war had gotten to my friend. He had lost, briefly I hoped, all his sensitivity. He was a 20th century savage now, mild-mannered though he still was. I shuddered to think that I might do the same thing if the war went on and on. Several of our Marines came over to see what my buddy had. "You dumb jerk. Throw that thing away before it begins to stink," growled an NCO. "Hell yes," added another man. "I don't want you going aboard ship with me if you got that thing. Gives me the creeps," he said as he looked disgustedly at the souvenir. After several other men chimed in with their disapproval, my friend reluctantly flung his unique souvenir among the rocks. We had good rations and began to eat heartily and enjoy being out of the line as we relaxed more each day. Good water came up by jeep with the rations, and I never brushed my teeth so many times a day. It was a luxury. Rumors began to spread that we would soon board ship and leave Peleliu. Toward the end of October, we moved to another part of the island. Our spirits soared. We bivouacked in a sandy, flat area near the beach. Jeeps brought in our jungle hammocks and our knapsacks. A knapsack was the lower half of the two-part World War II Marine combat pack. The upper part was called the haversack. The latter half was the part a Marine normally carried with him into a fight. We received orders to shave and to put on clean dungarees we all carried in our knapsacks. Some men complained that it would be easier to clean up aboard ship, but one NCO laughed and said that if our scroungy, stinking bunch of Marines climbed a cargo net aboard ship, the sailors would jump over the other side as soon as they saw us. My hair, though it had been short on D-Day, had grown into a thick, matted mass plastered together with rifle oil and coral dust. Long ago I had thrown away my pocket comb because most of the teeth had broken out when I tried to comb my hair. I managed now to clean up my head with soap and water, and it took both edges of 2 razor blades and a complete tube of shaving soap to shave off the itching, greasy tangle of coral-encrusted beard. I felt like a man freed of a hair shirt. My dungaree jacket wasn't torn, and I felt I must keep it as a souvenir of good luck. I rinsed it in the ocean, dried it in the sun, and put it into my pack. I later wore this same lucky jacket through the long, muddy Okinawa campaign. Faded now, it hangs peacefully in my closet, one of my most prized possessions. My filthy dungaree trousers were ragged and torn in the knees, so I threw them into a campfire along with my stinking socks. The jagged coral had worn away the tough, inch-thick cord soles of my new boondockers of 15 September to the thin inner soles. I had to keep these until we returned to Pavuvu, because my replacement shoes were back there in my sea bag. That afternoon, 29 October, we learned that we would board ship the next day. With a feeling of intense relief, I climbed into my hammock at dusk and zipped up the mosquito netting along the side. I was delighted at how comfortable it was to lie on something other than hard, rocky ground. I lay back, sighed, and thought of the good sleep I should get until my turn for sentry duty came around. I could look inland and see the ragged crest of those terrible ridges against the skyline. Thank goodness that section was in U.S. hands, I thought. Suddenly, zip, 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 a burst of Japanese machine gun fire, blue-white tracers, slashed through the air under my hammock. The bullets kicked up sand on the other side of a crater beneath me. I jerked open the hammock zipper. Carbine in hand, I tumbled out into the crater. After all I had been through, I wasn't taking any chances of getting my rear end shot off in a hammock. Judging from the sound made by the bullets, the machine gun was a long way off. The gunner was probably firing a burst toward the Army lines over on some ridge between him and me, but a man could get killed just as dead by a stray bullet as an aimed one. So after my brief moments of comfort in the hammock, I slept the rest of the night in the crater. Next morning, 30 October, we squared away our packs, picked up our gear, and moved out to board ship. Even though we were leaving bloody Peleliu at last, my mind was distracted by an oppressive feeling that Bloody Nose Ridge was pulling us back like some giant, inexorable magnet. It had soaked up the blood of our division like a great sponge. I believed that it would get us yet. Even if we boarded ship, we would get jerked off and thrown into the line to help stop a counterattack or some threat to the airfield. I suppose I had become completely fatalistic. Our casualties had been so heavy that it was impossible for me to believe we were actually leaving Peleliu. The sea was quite rough, and I looked back at the island with great relief as we put out for the ship. We pulled alongside a big merchant troop ship, the Sea Runner, and prepared to climb a cargo net to get aboard. We had done this sort of thing countless times in our training, but never when we were so terribly exhausted. We had a hard time even getting started up the net because we kept bobbing up and down in the heavy sea. Several men stopped to rest on the way, but no one fell. As I struggled upward with my load of equipment, I felt like a weary insect climbing a vine. But at last I was crawling up out of the abyss of Peleliu. We were assigned to quarters in troop compartments below decks. I stowed my gear on my rack and went topside. The salt air was delicious to breathe. What a luxury to inhale long, deep breaths of fresh, clean air that wasn't heavy with the fetid stench of death. The cost in casualties for a tiny island was terrible. The fine 1st Marine Division was shattered. It suffered a total loss of 6,526 men, 1,252 dead, and 5,274 wounded. The casualties in the division's infantry regiments were 1st Marines, 1,749, 5th Marines, 1,378, 7th Marines, 1,497. These were severe losses considering that each infantry regiment started with about 3,000 men. The Army's 81st Infantry Division would lose another 3,278 men, 542 dead and 2,736 wounded, before it secured the island. Most of the enemy garrison on Peleliu died. Only a few were captured. Estimates as to the exact losses by the Japanese vary somewhat, but conservatively, 10,900 Japanese soldiers died, and 302 became prisoners. Of the prisoners, only 7 were soldiers and 12 sailors. The remainder were laborers of other Oriental extractions. Company K, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, went into Peleliu with approximately 235 men, the normal size of a World War II Marine Rifle Company. It left with only 85 unhurt. It suffered 64% casualties. Of its original 7 officers, 2 remained for the return to Pavuvu. For its actions on Peleliu and Ngesabus, the 1st Marine Division received the Presidential Unit Citation. Even at a distance, Peleliu was ugly with the jagged ridges and shattered trees. Haney came up alongside me and leaned on the rail. He looked gloomily at the island and puffed a cigarette. "Well, Haney, what did you think of Peleliu?" I asked. I really was curious what a veteran with a combat record that included some of the big battles of the Western Front during World War I thought of the first battle in which I had participated. I had nothing in my experience to make a comparison with Peleliu. Instead of the usual old salt comment, something like, "You think that was bad, you ought to have been in the old Corps," Haney answered with an unexpected, "Boy, that was terrible. I ain't never seen nothing like it. I'm ready to go back to the States. I've had enough after that." A common perception has it that the worst battle to any man is the one he had been in himself. In view of Haney's comments, I concluded that Peleliu must have been as bad as I thought it was, even though it was my first battle. Haney's long Marine Corps career as a combat infantryman certainly qualified him as a good judge of how bad a battle had been. His simple words were enough to convince me about the severity of the fight we had just been through. None of us would ever be the same after what we had endured. To some degree, that is true, of course, of all human experience. But something in me died at Peleliu. Perhaps it was a childish innocence that accepted as faith the claim that man is basically good. Possibly I lost faith that politicians in high places who do not have to endure war's savagery will ever stop blundering and sending others to endure it. But I also learned important things on Peleliu. A man's ability to depend on his comrades and immediate leadership is absolutely necessary. I'm convinced that our discipline, esprit de corps, and tough training were the ingredients that equipped me to survive the ordeal physically and mentally, given a lot of good luck, of course. I learned realism, too. To defeat an enemy as tough and dedicated as the Japanese, we had to be just as tough. We had to be just as dedicated to America as they were to their emperor. I think this was the essence of Marine Corps doctrine in World War II, and that history vindicates this doctrine. To this private first class, Peleliu was also a vindication of Marine Corps training, particularly of boot camp. I speak only from a personal viewpoint and make no generalizations. But for me, in the final analysis, Peleliu was 30 days of severe, unrelenting, inhuman emotional and physical stress. Proof that I could trust and depend completely on the Marine on each side of me and on our leadership. Proof that I could use my weapons and equipment efficiently under severe stress. And proof that the critical factor in combat stress is duration of the combat rather than the severity. Boot camp taught me that I was expected to excel or try to, even under stress. My drill instructor was a small man. He didn't have a big mouth. He was neither cruel nor sadistic. He wasn't a bully. But he was a strict disciplinarian, a total realist about our future, and an absolute perfectionist dedicated to excellence. To him, more than to my disciplined home life, a year of college ROTC before boot camp, and months of infantry training afterward, I attribute my ability to have withstood the stress of Peleliu. The Japanese were as dedicated to military excellence as U.S. Marines. Consequently, on Peleliu, the opposing forces were like two scorpions in a bottle. One was annihilated, the other nearly so. Only Americans who excelled could have defeated them. Okinawa would be the longest and largest battle of the Pacific War. There, my division would suffer about as many casualties as it did on Peleliu. Again, the enemy garrison would fight to the death. On Okinawa, I would be shelled and shot at more, see more enemy soldiers, and fire at more of them with my mortar and with small arms than on Peleliu. But there was a ferocious, vicious nature to the fighting on Peleliu that made it unique for me. Many of my veteran comrades agreed. Perhaps we can say of Peleliu, as the Englishman Robert Graves said of World War I, that it gave us infantrymen so convenient a measuring stick for discomfort, grief, pain, fear, and horror that nothing since has greatly daunted us. But it also brought new meanings of courage, patience, loyalty, and greatness of spirit, incommunicable, we found, to later times. As I crawled out of the abyss of combat and over the rail of the Sea Runner, I realized that compassion for the sufferings of others is a burden to those who have it. As Wilfred Owen's poem, Insensibility, puts it so well, those who feel most for others suffer most in war. Part 2. Okinawa, the Final Triumph. Chapter 7. Rest and Rehabilitation. Early next morning, the Sea Runner, in convoy with other ships, including those carrying the survivors of the 7th Marines, put out for Pavuvu. I was glad to be aboard ship again, even a troop ship. I drank gallons of ice-cold water from the electrically cooled scuttlebutts. This is a naval slang word referring either to water coolers aboard ship or to roomers. perhaps the double meaning derived from a habit of sailors and Marines of swapping rumors when gathered around a water cooler for a drink. Most of my old friends in rifle companies had been wounded or killed. It was terribly depressing, and the full realization of our losses bore down heavily on me as we made inquiries. The survivors on board gave us all the details regarding our friends who hadn't made it through Peleliu. We thanked them and moved on. After a few of the visits and bad news about lost friends, I began to feel that I hadn't been just lucky, but was a survivor of a major tragedy. One day, after noon chow, a friend and I were sitting on our racks discussing things in general. The conversation drifted off, and we fell silent. Suddenly, he looked at me with an intense, pained expression on his face and said, "Sledgehammer, why the hell did we have to take Peleliu?" I must have looked at him blankly, because he began to argue that our losses on Peleliu had been useless and hadn't helped the war effort at all, and that the island could have been bypassed. Hell, the Army landed troops on Morotai, Netherlands East Indies, with light opposition the same day we landed on Peleliu, and we caught hell, and the damn place still ain't secured. And while we were on Peleliu, MacArthur hit Leyte in the Philippines 20 October and walked ashore standing up. I just don't see where we did any good," he continued. I replied gloomily, "I don't know." He just stared at the bulkhead and sadly shook his head. He was the same friend who had been with me the time we saw the 3 terribly mutilated Marine dead. I could imagine what he was thinking. Despite these momentary lapses, the veterans of Peleliu knew they had accomplished something special, that these Marines had been able to survive the intense physical exertion of weeks of combat on Peleliu in that incredibly muggy heat gave ample evidence of their physical toughness. That we had survived emotionally, at least for the moment, was and is ample evidence to me that our training and discipline were the best. They prepared us for the worst, which is what we experienced on Peleliu. On 7 November 1944, 3 days after my 21st birthday, the Sea Runner entered Makiti Bay. After passing familiar islets, she dropped anchor off Pavuvu's steel pier. I was surprised at how good Pavuvu looked after the desolation of Peleliu. We picked up our gear and debarked shortly. On the beach, we walked over to one of several tables set up nearby. There I saw, of all things, an American Red Cross girl. She was serving grapefruit juice in small paper cups. Some of my buddies looked at the Red Cross woman sullenly, sat on their helmets, and waited for orders. But together with several other men, I went over to the table where the young lady handed me a cup of juice, smiled, and said she hoped I liked it. I looked at her with confusion as I took the cup and thanked her. My mind was so benumbed by the shock and violence of Peleliu that the presence of an American girl on Pavuvu seemed totally out of context. I was bewildered. What the hell is she doing here? I thought. She's got no more business here than some damn politician. As we filed past to board trucks, I resented her deeply. Next to a table, counting off the men to board the trucks, stood a brand spanking new boot second lieutenant. He was so obviously fresh from the States and Officers' Candidate School that his khakis were new, and he wasn't even suntanned. As I moved slowly by the table, he said, "Okay, Sonny, move out." Since my enlistment in the Marine Corps, I had been called about everything imaginable, printable and unprintable. But fresh off Peleliu, I was unprepared for Sonny. I turned to the officer and stared at him blankly. He returned my gaze and seemed to realize his mistake. He looked hurriedly away. My buddy's eyes still carried that vacant, hollow look typical of men recently out of the shock of battle. Maybe that's what the young lieutenant saw in mine, and it made him uncomfortable. The trucks sped past neat tent areas, much improved since we had last seen Pavuvu. We arrived at our familiar camp area to find numerous self-conscious replacements sitting and standing in and around the tents. We were the old men now. They appeared so relaxed and innocent of what lay ahead of us that I felt sorry for them. We took off our packs and settled into our tents. In the best way we could, we tried to unwind and relax. Shortly after we arrived back at Pavuvu, and on an occasion when all the replacements were out of the company area on work parties, First Sergeant David P. Bailey yelled, "K Company, fall in!" As the survivors of Peleliu straggled out of their tents into the company street, I thought about how few remained out of the 235 men we started with. Dressed in clean khakis and with his bald head shining, Bailey walked up to us and said, "At ease, men." He was a real old-time salty Marine and a stern disciplinarian, but a mild-mannered man whom we highly respected. Bailey had something to say, and it wasn't merely a pep talk. Unfortunately, I don't remember his exact words, so I won't attempt to quote him. But he told us we should be proud. He said we had fought well in as tough a battle as the Marine Corps had ever been in, and we had upheld the honor of the Corps. He finished by saying, "You people have proved you are good Marines." Then he dismissed us. We returned silently and thoughtfully to our tents. I heard no cynical comments about Bailey's brief remarks. Words of praise were rare from the heart of such a stern old salt, who expected every man to do his best and tolerated nothing less. His straightforward, sincere praise and statement of respect and admiration for what our outfit had done made me feel like I had won a medal. His talk was not the loud harangue of a politician or the cliché-studded speech of some rear-echelon officer or journalist. It was a quiet statement of praise from one who had endured the trials of Peleliu with us. As far as being a competent judge of us, there was nobody better qualified than an old combat Marine and a senior NCO like Bailey, who had observed us and endured the fight himself. His words meant a lot to me, and they apparently did to my comrades, too. One of our first activities after getting settled in our Pavuvu tents was to renew our old feud with the rats and land crabs. Our sea bags, cots, and other gear had been stacked around the center tent pole while we were gone. The land crabs had moved in and made themselves at home. When several of my tent mates and I started unstacking the items around the tent pole, the crabs swarmed out. The men started yelling, cursing the crabs, and smashing them with bayonets and entrenching tools. Some character sprayed cigarette lighter fluid on a crab as it ran into the company street and then threw a match at it. The flaming crab moved a couple of feet before being killed by the flames. "Hey, you guys, did you see that? That crab looked just like a burning Jap tank." "Good-o!" yelled another man as Marines rushed around trying to find more cans of lighter fluid to spray on the hated land crabs. Men started taking orders for cans of lighter fluid and raced off to the 5th Marines PX tent to buy up all they could find. We killed over 100 crabs from my tent alone. One evening after chow, as I sprawled on my cot, wishing I were back home, I noticed one of Company K's 2 surviving officers carrying some books and papers down the company's street in the twilight. He passed my tent and went to the 55-gallon oil drum that served as a trash can. The lieutenant tossed some maps and papers into the can. He held up a thick book and with obvious anger slammed it into the trash can. He then turned and walked slowly back up the street. curious. I went out to have a look. The maps were combat maps of Peleliu. I dropped them back into the trash and have since regretted I didn't salvage them for future historical reference. Then I found the book. It was a large hardback volume of about 1,000 pages, bound in dark blue, obviously not a GI field manual or book of regulations. Always seeking good reading material, I looked at the spine of the book and read its title, Men at War, by Ernest Hemingway. This is interesting history, I thought, and was puzzled as to why the lieutenant had thrown it so violently into the trash. I opened the cover. In the twilight, I saw written in a bold, strong hand, A. Haldane. A lump rose in my throat as I asked myself why I'd want to read about war when Peleliu had cost us our company commander and so many good friends. I, too, slammed the book down into the trash can in a gesture of grief and disgust over the waste of war I had already experienced firsthand. After we had been back on Pavuvu about a week, I had one of the most heartwarming and rewarding experiences of my entire enlistment in the Marine Corps. It was after taps. All the flambeaux were out, and all of my tent mates were in their sacks with mosquito nets in place. We were all very tired, still trying to unwind from the tension and ordeal of Peleliu. All was quiet, except for someone who had begun snoring softly, when one of the men, a Gloucester veteran, who had been wounded on Peleliu, said in steady, measured tones, "You know something, Sledgehammer?" "What?" I answered. "I kinda had my doubts about you," he continued, "and how you'd act when we got into combat and the stuff hit the fan. I mean, your old man being a doctor and you having been to college and being sort of a rich kid compared to some guys. But I kept my eye on you on Peleliu, and by God, you did okay. You did okay." "Thanks, old buddy," I replied, nearly bursting with pride. Many men were decorated with medals they richly earned for their brave actions in combat, medals to wear on their blouses for everyone to see. I was never awarded an individual decoration, but the simple, sincere, personal remarks of approval by my veteran comrade that night after Peleliu were like a medal to me. I have carried them in my heart with great pride and satisfaction ever since. As Christmas approached, rumor had it we were going to have a feast of real turkey. There were several days out of the year when the Marine Corps tried to give us good chow. 10 November, the Marine Corps birthday, Thanksgiving, Christmas, and New Year's. The rest of the time in the Pacific War, chow was canned or dehydrated. Refrigeration facilities for large quantities of food were not available, at least not to a unit as mobile and as lacking in all luxuries as a combat division in the Fleet Marine Force. But the scuttlebutt was that there were frozen turkeys for us in the big refrigerators on Banika. We had special Christmas Eve church services in the palm-thatched regimental chapel that had been constructed skillfully by Russell Island natives. That was followed by a special Christmas program at the regimental theater, where we sat on coconut logs and sang carols. I enjoyed it a great deal, but felt pretty homesick. Then we had our roast turkey, and it was excellent. New Year's celebration was even more memorable for me. On New Year's Eve after chow, I heard some yelling and other commotion over at the battalion mess hall. The messmen had just about finished squaring away the galley for the night when a sentry shouted, "Corporal of the Guard, fire at post number 3. I saw cooks and messmen in the mess hall who were cleaning up by lamplight all rush outside to a fire burning in a grove of trees near the galley. I thought one of the gasoline heaters that boiled water in tubs where we cleaned our mess kits had caught fire. By the light of the flames, I could see men running around the galley yelling, and I could hear the mess sergeant cursing and shouting orders. I also saw two figures slide through the shadows toward our company's street, but paid them little heed. In a few minutes, the fire was put out, just a can of gasoline some distance from the mess hall that had somehow caught fire, somebody said. A friend of mine appeared at my tent and said in a low voice, "Hey, you guys, Howard says come on down to his tent. Plenty of turkey for everybody." We followed him on the double. As I entered the tent, there sat Howard Neese on his cot, a flambeau flickering beside him, and a towel on his lap under a huge, plump roast turkey. "Happy New Year, you guys," Howard said with his characteristically broad grin. We filed past him as he deftly sliced off huge slabs of turkey with his razor-sharp K-bar and placed them into our opened hands. Others came in, and we broke out our 2 cans of warm beer that each had been issued. Someone produced a can of jungle juice that had been working. A guitar, a fiddle, and a mandolin struck up the Spanish fandango as Howard sliced turkey until the carcass was cleaned. Then he directed the music, using his K-bar as a baton. Howard told us the burning can of gasoline had been merely a diversion to distract the mess sergeant while he and a couple of other daredevils entered the galley and made a moonlight requisition of 2 turkeys. We, the survivors of that recent bloodbath on Peleliu, forgot our troubles and howled with laughter at the story. Enjoying the comradeship forged by combat, we had the finest New Year's Eve party I've ever attended. The 11th Marines fired an artillery salute at midnight as a peaceful gesture. It was typical of Howard that he pulled off his turkey requisition so neatly, and just as typical that he shared it with as many of his buddies as he could. He was one of those wonderfully buoyant souls, always friendly and joking, cool-headed in combat, and though much admired, very modest. When Howard was killed by a Japanese machine gun in the early days of the Okinawa battle, his 3rd campaign, every man who knew him was deeply saddened. By his example, he taught me more than anyone else the value of cheerfulness in the face of adversity. One of my most treasured memories is the mental picture of Howard Neese sitting on his bunk, carving a huge turkey on his lap with his K-bar, by the light of a flambeau in his tent under Pavuvu's palms on New Year's Eve, 1944, grinning and saying, "Happy New Year, Sledgehammer." I profited greatly from knowing him. Our new division commander, Major General Pedro del Valle, former commander of the 11th Marines, ordered regular close-order drills, parades, and reviews. This was better than work parties moving rotting coconuts, and added a spit and polish to our routine that helped morale. A regular beer ration of 2 cans a man each week also helped. During close-order drill, we dressed in clean khakis, which each man pressed under his mattress pad on his canvas bunk. As we marched back and forth on the neat coral-covered parade ground, I thought about home or some book I was reading and wasn't at all bored. One day we had a 5th Regiment parade. Decorations and medals were awarded to those cited for outstanding service on Peleliu. Many of our wounded had returned from the hospitals by then. When the Purple Heart Medal was awarded to those who had been wounded, there weren't many of us who didn't qualify for it. During those parades, we took great pride in seeing our regimental flag carried with us. Like all the regimental flags, it had a large Marine Corps emblem on it with United States Marine Corps emblazoned across the top. Below the emblem was 5th Marine Regiment. But the thing that made our flag unique was the number of battle streamers attached at the top of staff. These streamers, ribbons about a foot long with the names of battles printed on them, represented battles the 5th Marines had fought in and decorations the regiment had won, all the way back to Belleau Wood, World War I, and the Banana Wars in South America. We had just added Peleliu to the World War II collection. Those streamers represented more battles than any other Marine regiment had fought in. One buddy said our flag had so many battle streamers, decorations, and ribbons that it looked like a mop, an unsophisticated yet straight-from-the-shoulder summation of a proud tradition. After we had been back on Pavuvu several weeks, I was told one day to dress in clean khakis and to report to the company headquarters tent promptly at 0100. There was some vague reference to an interview that might lead to officers' candidate school back in the States. "Hey, Sledgehammer, you'll have it made, being an officer and all that, wheeling and dealing stateside," a buddy said as I got ready for the interview. "If you're lucky, maybe you can land a desk job," another said. Some of my buddies were obviously envious as I left and walked nervously down the street. The thoughts in my head were that I didn't want or intend to leave Company K, unless as a casualty or rotated home for good. And why on earth had I been chosen for an interview regarding OCS? When I arrived at the company headquarters, I was sent to a tent a short distance away, near the battalion headquarters. I reported to the tent and was greeted cordially by a first lieutenant. He was an extremely handsome man, and I gathered from his composure and modest self-confidence a combat veteran. He asked me in detail about my background and education. He was sincere and friendly. I felt he was trying carefully to determine whether the men he interviewed were suitable to be Marine officers. He and I hit it off well, and I was perfectly honest with him. He asked me why I had not succeeded in the V-12 Officers Candidate Program, and I told him how I felt about joining the Marine Corps and being sent to college. "How do you feel about it now that you've been in combat?" he asked. I told him it would be nice to be back in college. I said I had seen enough on Peleliu to satisfy my curiosity and ardor for fighting. "In fact," I said, "I'm ready to go home." He laughed good-naturedly and knowingly. He asked me how I liked the Marine Corps and my unit. I told him I was proud to be a member. He asked me how I liked being a 60mm mortar crewman, and I said it was my first choice. Then he got very serious and asked, "How would you feel about sending men into a situation where you knew they would be killed?" Without hesitation, I answered, "I couldn't do it, sir." The lieutenant looked at me long and hard in a friendly, analytical way. He asked me a few more questions, then said, "Would you like to be an officer?" "Yes, sir, if it meant I could go back to the States," I said. He laughed, and with a few more friendly remarks, told me that was all. My buddies asked me for all the details of the interview. When I told them all about it, one said, "Sledgehammer, damn if you ain't got to be as Asiatic as Haney. Why the hell didn't you snow that lieutenant so you could go into OCS?" I replied that the lieutenant was experienced and too wise to fall for a snow job. That was true, of course, but I really had no desire to leave Company K. It was home to me, and I had a strong feeling of belonging to the company, no matter how miserable or dangerous conditions might be. Besides, I had found my niche as a mortarman. The weapon and its deployment interested me greatly, and if I had to fight again, I was confident of doing the Japanese far more damage as a mortarman than as a second lieutenant. I had no desire to be an officer or command anybody. I just wanted to be the best mortar crewman I could, and to survive the war. There was nothing heroic or unique in my attitude. Other men felt the same way. Actually, in combat, our officers caught just as much hell as the enlisted men. They also were burdened with responsibility. As one buddy, a private, said, "When the stuff hits the fan, all I have to do is what I'm told, and I can look out for just me and my buddy. Them officers all the time got to be checking maps and squaring people away. We began to assimilate the new replacements into the company, and we added a third mortar to my section. The battalion ordnance section checked all weapons, and we got new issues for those worn out in the fight for Peleliu. There were some drafted Marines among the new replacements, and also a sprinkling of NCOs who had been in Navy yards and other stateside duty stations. The presence of the NCOs caused some bitterness among a few of the Gloucester and Peleliu veterans, who were by then senior in their squads because of the heavy casualties on Peleliu. The latter wouldn't get promoted with new NCOs entering the company to take our leadership positions. From what I saw, however, the new NCOs were mostly men with numerous years of service, although not combat veterans. They did a good job of assuming their authority while respecting us combat veterans for our experience. The drafted Marines took a good bit of kidding about being handcuffed volunteers from those of us who had enlisted into the Marine Corps. Some of the drafted men insisted vehemently that they were volunteers who had enlisted like most of us, but they were careful to conceal their records and identification because SS, for Selective Service, appeared after the serial number if a man had been drafted. The draftees sometimes had their laugh on us, though. If we griped and complained, they grinned and said, "What you guys bitching about? You asked for it, didn't you?" We just grumbled at them. No one got angry about it. For the most part, the replacements were good men, and the company retained its fighting spirit. Our training picked up in intensity, and rumors began to fly regarding the next blitz, a term commonly used for a campaign. We heard that the 1st Marine Division was to be put into an army to invade the China coast, or Formosa, Taiwan. Many of my buddies feared that we would lose our identity as Marines, and that the Marine Corps would finally be absorbed into the U.S. Army, a fate that has caused anxiety to U.S. Marines of many generations, as history well documents. Our training emphasized street fighting and cooperation with tanks in open country, but we still didn't know the name of our objective. After we were shown maps, without names, of a long, narrow island, we still didn't know. One day, Tom F. Martin, a friend of mine in Company L, who also had been in the V-12 program and was a Peleliu veteran, came excitedly to my tent and showed me a National Geographic map of the Northern Pacific. On it, we saw the same oddly shaped island. Located 325 miles south of the southern tip of the Japanese home island of Kyushu, it was called Okinawa Shima. Its closeness to Japan assured us of one thing beyond any doubt. Whatever else happened, the battle for Okinawa was bound to be bitter and bloody. The Japanese never had sold any island cheaply, and the pattern of the war until then had shown that the battles became more vicious the closer we got to Japan. We made practice landings, fired various small arms, and underwent intensive mortar training. With a third weapon added to our mortar section, I felt as though we were Company K's artillery battery. At this time, hepatitis broke out among the troops. We called it yellow jaundice, and I got a bad case. We could look at a man and tell whether he had the malady by the yellowing of the whites of his eyes. Even our deeply tanned skins took on a sallow appearance. I felt terrible, was tired, and the smell of food nauseated me. Pavuvu's muggy heat didn't help any either. I went to sick call one morning, as other Marines were doing in increasing numbers. The medical officer gave me a light-duty slip, a piece of paper officially relieving me from the intense exertion of routine training, but still making me subject to minor work parties such as picking up trash, straightening tent ropes, and the like. It was the only time during my entire service in the Marine Corps that I got out of regular duties because of illness. Had we been civilians, I'm confident those of us with hepatitis would have been hospitalized. Instead, we received APC pills from a corpsman. a non-prescription all-purpose painkiller containing aspirin and caffeine, among other ingredients. This medication was the standard remedy for everything except bayonet, gunshot, or shrapnel wounds. After several days, I was pronounced recovered enough for resumption of regular duties and surrendered my cherished light-duty slip to an officer in sickbay. Training intensified. During January 1945, the company boarded an LCI, Landing Craft Infantry, a sort of miniature LST, which carried about a company of infantry plus a few vehicles, in convoy with other such vessels. Went to Guadalcanal for maneuvers. After a division-sized field problem, we returned to Pavuvu on 25 January. Then we listened daily with sympathetic interest to the news reports of the terrible fighting encountered by the 3rd, 4th, and 5th Marine Divisions during the battle for Iwo Jima that began on 19 February. "It sounds just like a larger version of Peleliu," a buddy of mine said one day. He didn't realize how correct he was. The new pattern of defense in depth and no bonsai charges that the Japanese had tried on the 1st Marine Division at Peleliu was repeated on Iwo Jima. When that island was declared secured on 16 March, the cost to the 3 Marine Divisions which fought there sounded like our Peleliu casualties, magnified 3 times. During our training, we were told that we would have to climb over a seawall or cliff, exact height unknown, to move inland during the coming battle. Several times we practiced scaling a sheer coral cliff, about 40 feet high, across the bay from the division's camp on Pavuvu. We had no more than 2 ropes to get the entire company up and over the cliff. Supposedly we would be furnished rope ladders before D-Day, but I never saw any. While we stood at the foot of the cliff during those exercises, waiting our turn and watching other men struggle up the ropes to the top of the cliff with all their combat gear, I heard some choice comments from my buddies regarding the proceedings. The company officers, all new except First Lieutenant Stanley, the CO, were rushing around with great enthusiasm, urging the troops up the cliff like it was some sort of college football training routine. What a fouled-up bunch of boot lieutenants, if I ever saw any. Just what the hell do they think them goddamn nips are going to be doing while we climb up that cliff one at a time? Grumbled a veteran machine gunner. Seems pretty stupid to me. If that beach is anything like Peleliu, we'll get picked off before anybody gets up any cliff, I said. You said that right, Sledgehammer. And them nips ain't gonna be sitting around on their cans. They're gonna bracket that beach with mortars and artillery, and machine guns are gonna sweep the top of that cliff, he said with melancholy resignation. Our new mortar section leader was a New Englander out of an Ivy League college. Mac was blond, not large, but well-built, energetic, and talkative, with a broad New England accent. He was a conscientious officer, but he irritated the veterans by talking frequently and at length about what he was going to do to the Japanese when he went into action again. We sometimes heard such big talk from enlisted replacements who were trying to impress someone, mostly themselves, with how brave they would be under fire. But Mac was about the only officer I ever heard indulge in it. Whenever he got started with, "The first time one of our guys gets hit, it's going to make me so mad that I'm going to take my K-bar between my teeth and my .45 in my hand and charge the Japs," all the veterans would sit back and smirk. We threw knowing glances at each other and rolled our eyes like disgusted schoolboys listening to a coach brag that he could lick the opposing team single-handed. I felt embarrassed for Mac, because it was so obvious he conceived combat as a mixture of football and a Boy Scout campout. He wouldn't listen to the few words of caution from some of us who suggested he had a shock coming. I agreed with a buddy from Texas who said, I hope to God that big-mouth Yankee lieutenant has to eat every one of them words of his when the stuff hits the fan. The Texans' wish came true on Okinawa, and it was one of the funniest things I ever saw under fire. Before the next campaign, we had to take the usual inoculations, plus some additional ones. Our arms were sore, and many men became feverish. The troops hated getting injections, and the large number, someone said it was 7 before Okinawa, made us crotchety. The plague shot burned like fire and was the worst. Most of our corpsmen did a good job of making the shots as painless as possible, and this helped. But we had one arrogant corpsman who was unfeeling about other people's pain. He wasn't popular, to say the least. I hasten to add that he was the one and only U.S. Navy hospital corpsman I knew in the Marine Corps who didn't conduct himself in an exemplary manner. All other corpsmen I saw were probably more highly respected by Marines, as a group and as individuals, than any other group of people we were involved with. Directly in front of me as we lined up for shots was a buddy who was a Peleliu veteran. In front of him were several new replacements. The more new men Doc Arrogant stuck with the needle, the worse he became. He was just plain mean by the time he got to my buddy. Doc Arrogant was in a hurry and didn't look up to recognize my buddy as the latter stepped up to the table. It nearly cost Doc dearly. He held the needle like a dart, plunged it into my friend's arm, depressed the plunger, and said, "Move out." My friend didn't flinch from the painful shot. He turned slowly, shook his fist in the corpsman's face, and said, "You son of a bitch! If you want to do some bayonet practice, I'll meet you out on the bayonet course with fixed bayonets and no scabbards on the blades, and then see what you can do." Doc Arrogant looked shocked. He was speechless when he realized that the arm he had punctured so roughly wasn't attached to a meek replacement, but to a seasoned veteran. Then my friend said, "If you ever give me another shot like that, I'll grab you by the stacking swivel and beat you down to parade rest. I'll whip your ass so bad you won't even be able to make this next blitz, because I'll have to award you a Purple Heart when I finish with you, wise guy." Doc Arrogant changed instantly into Doc Meek. When I stepped up for my shot, he administered it with a gentleness that would have done credit to Florence Nightingale. We started packing up our gear. Soon we got word that we would have more maneuvers on Guadalcanal, then shove off for our next fight, Okinawa. Chapter 8. Prelude to Invasion. From the standpoint of personal satisfaction, I've always been glad that as long as we had to pull maneuvers somewhere in preparation for Peleliu and Okinawa, this training took place on Guadalcanal. The name of that island was embroidered in white letters down the red number 1 on our division patch, of which we were all very proud. Guadalcanal had great symbolic significance. I was glad I got to see some of the areas fought over by the 1st Marine Division during the campaign, and got some first-hand accounts on the spot of what had taken place from veterans who had participated in making that history. During one period of maneuvers on Guadalcanal, we stayed ashore for 2 or 3 weeks and bivouacked in an area that had been the camp of the 3rd Marine Division before its troops went into the hell of Iwo Jima. We strung our jungle hammocks and made ourselves as comfortable as possible. Each day for several days we went out into the hills, jungles, and kunai grass fields for training, and we enjoyed a cool shower each afternoon after coming in from the field. Guadalcanal was a big base by early 1945 and had many service troops and rear echelon units on it. Across the road from us was a battalion of Seabees, Naval Construction Battalion. Late one afternoon, 3 or 4 of us went over and eased quietly into the end of their chow line. Their cooks recognized us as Marines, but didn't say anything. We loaded up on real ice cream, fresh pork chops, fresh salad, and good bread, all unheard-of delicacies on Pavuvu, and sat at a clean table in a spacious mess hall. It sure beats sea rations in a bivouac area. As intruders, we expected to be thrown out any minute. No one seemed to notice us, though. Next afternoon, we returned along with other Marines who had the same idea and enjoyed another excellent supper. Next day, we tried it again, easing quietly and slowly along to the chow line, trying not to attract attention. To my amazement, a large, neatly painted white sign with blue letters and blue border had been placed above the entrance to the chow line since the previous evening. I don't remember the exact wording, but it went something close to this: Marines welcomed in this chow line after all CB personnel have been through. We were as embarrassed as we were delighted. Those CBs had been fully aware of us all along and knew exactly how many Marines were slipping into their chow line. But they were willing and glad to share their extra chow with us as long as it lasted. The sign was necessary because CBs knew we would spread the word, and more hungry Marines would swarm over their chow line each day like ants. We were elated and went through the chow line grinning and thanking the messmen. They were the friendliest bunch I ever saw and made us feel like adopted orphans. The sign may have been made earlier for 3rd Division Marines who liked the CB's food as much as we, or it may have been put up for our benefit. In any event, we appreciated the good food and good treatment. It strengthened our respect for the CBs. The 3rd Battalion 5th Marines had been in the assault waves at Peleliu. Therefore, in the Okinawa campaign, we were assigned as regimental reserve. For the voyage to the island, consequently, we would be loaded aboard the attack transport ship, USS McCracken, instead of LSTs. Such APA transports sent troops ashore in LCVPs, small open landing craft known as Higgins boats, rather than amphibious tractors. One afternoon following landing exercises and field problems, our company returned to the beach to await the return of the Higgins boats that would pick us up and return us to the ship. Late afternoon sunlight danced on the beautiful blue waves, and a large fleet of ships stood offshore in Sea Lark Channel. Dozens of Higgins boats and other amphibious craft plied from the ships to shore, loading Marines and ferrying them out to the ships. It looked like some sort of boating festival, except that all the craft were military. One by one, the Higgins boats picked up men, about 25 at a time, from our beach area. We waited as the sun sank low in the west. The ships formed up in convoy and moved past us parallel to the beach. We had no rations or extra water, were tired from day-long maneuvers, and had no desire to spend the night on a mosquito-infested beach. Finally, as the last ship showed us its stern, a Higgins boat came plowing through the spray toward us. We were the only troops left on the beach. The coxswain revved his engine, ran the bow of the shallow draft boat up on the beach, and dropped the bow ramp with a bang. We clambered aboard, and someone yelled the customary, "Shove off, coxswain, you're loaded." We held onto the bulwarks of the boat as he raised the ramp, reversed engines, turned, and headed out at full throttle toward the disappearing ship. The sea was rough. As usual, Snafu started getting seasick, so he lay down on his side on the deck of the boat. We were crowded. 2 machine gun squads and 2 60mm mortar squads packed the Higgins boat, along with all our combat gear, small arms, mortars, and machine guns. A Higgins boat, like any powerful motor-driven boat under full throttle, normally settled down at the stern end with bow elevated and moved easily over the water. But our boat was so loaded with men and equipment that even though we crowded as far back in the stern as possible, the squared-off bow ramp wasn't elevated sufficiently to skip over the waves. It drove straight against some large waves, and water poured in through an open viewport. Usually, this 3-foot by 2-foot panel rode well above water level. The coxswain yelled instructions to close the folding steel shutters on the panel, which we did as quickly as possible, but water still sprayed over the bow ramp and in through the cracks around the panel. In the gathering twilight, we could see the stern of a transport far ahead of us. It was the last ship in the convoy that had passed from view around the end of Guadalcanal. Our coxswain made as much speed as possible to catch the transport, and we shipped more and more water. If we didn't catch up with that transport before dark, we didn't know when we would get back to our ship. Water began filling the bilges below the floor decking, so the coxswain started the pumps to keep us afloat. We stood by to bail with our helmets, but by the time the water rose above the flooring where we could get at it, the boat would probably sink because of its heavy load. The situation was grim, and I dreaded the thought of trying to swim the couple of miles through rough water to the beach. What irony, I thought, if some of us should die after surviving Peleliu by drowning on maneuvers in Iron Bottom Bay. Slowly we gained on the transport and finally drew alongside. Towering above us, the ship was packed with Marines. We shouted up to them for help. A Navy officer leaned over the rail and asked us which ship we were from. We told him we had missed the McCracken and requested to come aboard or we might sink. He gave orders to our coxswain to pull in close under a pair of davits. He did so, and 2 cables with hooks were lowered to us. Just as the hooks were fastened to rings in the floor, our Higgins boat seemed to start sinking. Only the cables held it up. A cargo net was lowered to us, and we scrambled up and aboard the ship. We were all mighty relieved to be out of that small boat. Several hours after dark, the ship arrived at the fleet anchorage. A signalman on the bridge went to work with his blinker light, sending code to other ships. The McCracken was located, and we were soon back aboard. "Where the hell you guys been so long?" asked a man at my troop compartment as we fell into our racks. "We went to Frisco for a beer," someone answered. "Wise guy," he replied. After maneuvers were completed, our convoy sailed from the Russell Islands on 15 March 1945. We were bound for Ulithi Atoll, where the convoy would join the gathering invasion fleet. We anchored off Ulithi on 21 March and remained there until 27 March. Ulithi Atoll lies about 260 miles northeast of Peleliu, on the western edge of the Caroline Islands. It was captured by an element of the 81st Infantry Division as a part of the Palau Islands operation. Ulithi consists of about 30 islets surrounding an enormous lagoon some 19 miles long and 5 to 10 miles wide. It became the major U.S. fleet anchorage in the Central Pacific. We lined the rails of our transport and looked out over the vast fleet in amazement. We saw ships of every description, huge new battleships, cruisers, sleek destroyers, and a host of fast escort craft. Aircraft carriers were there in greater numbers than any of us had ever seen before. Every conceivable type of amphibious vessel was arrayed. It was the biggest invasion fleet ever assembled in the Pacific, and we were awed by the sight of it. Because of tides and winds, the ships swung about on their anchor chains, and each day the fleet looked new and different. When I came topside each morning, I felt disoriented. It was a strange sensation, as though I were in a different frame of reference and had to learn my surroundings anew. The first afternoon at Ulithi, a fellow mortarman said, "Break out the field glasses and let's see how many kinds of ships we can identify." We passed the mortar section's field glasses around and whiled away many hours studying the different ships. Suddenly, someone gasped, "Look over there at that hospital ship off our port bow. Look at them nurses. Give me them field glasses." Lining the rail of the hospital ship were about a dozen American nurses looking out over the fleet. A scuffle erupted among us over who would use the field glasses first, but we all finally had a look at the girls. We whistled and waved, but we were too far away to be heard. Aside from the huge new battleships and carriers, we talked most about a terribly scorched and battered aircraft carrier anchored near us. A Navy officer told us she was the Franklin. During carrier raids on Japan, 18 to 21 March, Japanese suicide planes had crashed into the American carriers Wasp, Yorktown, and Franklin. The Franklin was the most heavily damaged of the three. Her loss was 724 killed and 265 wounded. That the ship was saved at all and later towed some 12,000 miles to New York for repairs was a tribute to the bravery and the skill of her crew. We could see charred and twisted aircraft on her flight deck, where they had been waiting loaded with bombs and rockets to take off when the ship was hit. It must have been a flaming inferno of bursting bombs and rockets and burning aviation gasoline. We looked silently at the battered, listing hulk, until one man said, "Ain't she a mess? Boy, them poor swabbies must have caught hell." Those of us who had lived through the blast and fire of Peleliu's artillery barrages could appreciate well the bravery of the sailors on the Franklin. While we were anchored at Ulithi, we went ashore on the tiny islet of Mogmog for recreation and physical conditioning. After some calisthenics, and to the delight of all hands, our officers broke out warm beer and Cokes. We had one of the most enjoyable baseball games I ever played. Everybody was laughing and running like a bunch of little boys. It was good to get off the cramped transport, stretch our legs, and relieve the monotony. We hated to board the Higgins boats at sunset to return to the ship and our cramped quarters. At Ulithi, we received briefings on the coming battle for Okinawa. This time, there was no promise of a short operation. "This is expected to be the costliest amphibious campaign of the war," a lieutenant said. "We will be hitting an island about 350 miles from the Japs' home islands, so you can expect them to fight with more determination than ever. We can expect 80 to 85% casualties on the beach." A buddy next to me leaned over and whispered, "How's that for boosting the troops' morale?" I only groaned. The lieutenant continued, "We may have trouble getting over that cliff or seawall in our sector. Also, according to G2, there is a large Jap gun, maybe 150 millimeter, in place just on the right flank of our battalion sector. We hope naval gunfire can knock it out. Be on the alert for a Jap paratrooper attack in our rear, particularly at night. It's pretty certain the Nips will pull off a massive counterattack, probably supported by tanks, sometime during our first night ashore or just before dawn. They'll bonsai and try to push us off the beachhead." Our planners still hadn't realized that this costly large-scale suicide charge tactic had been abandoned for good. The Japanese had shifted to the defense-in-depth tactic as the best means of defeating us. This tactical shift had prolonged our fight on Peleliu and had been repeated with the same murderous results against the Marines on Iwo Jima.
This ends Disc 7.